Hello, everyone. Great that you are tuning in our online talk about the future of the forests with our main focus, the Amazon. My name is Lotte, and this online talk is organized by SIP Utrecht and in collaboration with the
Hello,
Dutch...
everyone. Great that you are tuning in our online talk about the future of the forests with our main focus, the Amazon.
I'm hearing myself double. That's not good.
This online talk is organized by SIP Utrecht and in
internet browser. We're doing this talk in collaboration with the Dutch United Nations Association in celebration of the 75 year of the existence of the United Nations. Tonight we're going to talk about the future of the forests, specifically the Amazon, like I said. The Amazon is endangered, trees are cut down and fires are lit to create place for agriculture. This all happens, though, at the same time, we need areas like the Amazon more than ever before. We need to cool down our planet and to conserve biodiversity. In 2015, the United Nations, therefore, had a pretty clear plan, as they said. We must protect, restore, promote the sustainable use of ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat and reverse desertification and land degradation. And the biodiversity laws. Tonight we will discuss the ecological importance of areas like the Amazon, and we'll go into the causes and getting... I'm sorry, the text. We will discuss this together with Edwin Pos. So welcome, Edwin. Can you give a quick introduction of yourself?
A quick introduction. My name is Edwin, but you probably already realized that. I am an assistant professor in the research group of ecology and biodiversity at Utrecht University. And as of August, I'm also the scientific director at the Botanical Gardens. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about my research in just a few minutes. So maybe it's good to just leave it at that.
Yes. You have done research in the Amazon, and you are also a member of the Amazon Tree Diversity Network, I suppose, right?
Correct. Yep.
Yes. So, like I said, things are getting worse. I just lost my text just there. So things are getting a bit messy here. But we're going into the causes of why it is getting wrong, the future scenarios of the Amazon, and also we are going into your research a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about that, your research at the Amazon?
Sure. So my first actual experience in the Amazon was when I was still a student. I did a master project actually in Amazon in Brazil, and I climbed trees to search for vascular epiphytes, so the things that you usually sit at the side of the window, like bromeliads or orchids, and I collected them. That was actually my first experience, and then I got caught with the sheer diversity that you see there, and I just got enthusiastic about it. I just wanted to understand more about it. So my research at the moment is actually aiming at developing both theoretical and empirical approaches to quantify the various aspects of community assembly and the biodiversity dynamics. So what that means is I'm trying to understand the dynamics of ecosystems. So what is actually driving these ecosystems? What processes are important for the shaping and the maintaining of biodiversity, for instance? Where is it coming from? How much biodiversity is there, and how does it differ from place to place? And then if it differs, why does it differ? And I'm trying to do that using what we call empirical approaches. So we actually go into the field and we collect data. But then I also use a lot of theoretical approaches. So I use approaches from multiple disciplines, such as, of course, general ecology and evolution, but also from fields such as information theory, theoretical physics, and mathematics. And in particular, my work aims at advancing our understanding actually of what we call the relative importance of niche and neutral paradigms. So that what I mean by that is how important is natural selection, and how important are, for instance, stochastic processes in shaping these forests. My work primarily aims at the Amazonian trees, but the theory that we develop is actually applicable to basically any organism or any taxonomic group on the planet Earth. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find, so currently one of the things that I'm working on is developing a connection between the field of information theory, maximum entropy, maybe some of you have heard about this, chaos theory, and empirical evolutionary ecology, because I want to be able to disentangle signals of what we call quantitative selection. So if there is a signal of natural selection, what is selected for? And how can we disentangle this from all of this huge humble of data that we have? Because we go into the field. I'm not alone. I'm a member of the Amazonian Tree Diversity Network, which has over 180 authors. And that gives us a lot of data, but it also gives us a lot of data to work with, but it's not that easy to work with that. So I'm trying to develop methods to actually disentangle that data to see if we can find patterns that actually tell us something about the drivers of these ecosystems.
Mm-hmm. So I also understood that biodiversity is extremely important to sustain in the Amazon. I've understood that there are several scales of diversity. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and also in what scale are we here at the Amazon?
Yeah, sure. So now we're going to delve into the fundamentals of ecology. So if you talk about biodiversity, and this is something that pops up in the news on a daily basis, right? They say, well, the biodiversity declines, or we've lost so much biodiversity. And we actually divide this into several categories, and there are actually three main categories. So on the one hand, you have what we call alpha diversity. And alpha diversity is basically the diversity of one local patch. So say I'm going to go into the forest, say the forest behind me here, and I'm going to set out a plot, as we call it. So we're going to make an inventory of a particular part of this forest. Most often we do it in a 1 hectare plot. And then I'm going to count all the trees that are there. I'm trying to identify them, so I know where the species are, and I know how the individuals are distributed over these species. Mm-hmm. Then I know something about the diversity of that particular place within the forest. We call that alpha diversity. But then I can also do it on the other end of this forest. So I have one site that I do it at, and then I'm going to do it at another site. And then if I compare those two, that's what we call beta diversity. So that's actually the turnover of species between areas. Mm-hmm. And that tells us something about, for instance, how good are these species at dispersing? Or are the environmental conditions different, that not all of the species can actually occur there? You have these different filters, so to say. You have a dispersal filter and you have an environmental filter. And then we do this at many, many, many places. So that gives us an idea about the distribution of species over the Amazon. And then that total diversity, that's what we call gamma diversity. And the gamma diversity usually is a mathematical combination of both alpha and beta, because the alpha diversity at one point tells you something about how diverse is every particular place. And the beta diversity tells you the component of how is the turnover of this diversity from place to place. So the multiplication of those two then gives you an idea about the total diversity of an area. So you have gamma, beta, and alpha.
That's interesting. So
I
what?
agree.
Yeah. and which one of those three implies to the Amazon? Or is it all three of them?
If you look at it from a global scale, then the Amazon might be considered, well, kind of a beta diversity, but usually that's a scale that we talk about real gamma diversity as well. Because global diversity is, of course, another scale, but you have to take into account that things from the Amazon probably will not end up in Europe on their own, right?
Right.
So that's what we mean by containing these scales, because at some point they're a little bit arbitrary, of course. Because what is the total diversity? Where are these boundaries of the total diversity? So usually this is a little bit like an ecological system. We're talking about the Amazon basin, as what we call it. So usually when we talk about the Amazon forest, we're talking about the Amazon rainforest, so the basin of the rainforest. Mm-hmm. And that will be the gamma diversity if you're talking for the Amazon. And then when you go from place to place in the Amazon, then you're comparing beta diversity. But if you go in one place in the Amazon and you measure just one particular place, but this can also be a natural reserve, right? So I'm talking about a 1 hectare, but you can also say, well, I'm going to do 50 hectares because that's a natural reserve. And I'm going to check out whatever is within that reserve. That also might be considered alpha diversity. Mm-hmm. So the scaling is a little bit, relatively speaking, so to say.
Yeah. And to compare these different scales and areas in the Amazon is probably very interesting because there is much diversity there. But can you also do this research in a normal forest like in the Netherlands or in Europe? Or is that...
Of course. I mean, the theory behind it is no different. The system is different. I mean, you have less species and you have less diversity, but the idea is the same. So I can go into a beech forest here in the Netherlands and I'm going to take a plot of 1 hectare and I'm going to count all the trees that are there. Probably most of them, maybe all of them are beeches. And then I can go to a second area and I'm going to measure the same thing. and I'm going to compare those areas. And then I'm going to say something about the Veluwe, for instance, right? Or I can say something about the diversity of the Netherlands or Europe, or, so the idea is exactly the same. The forests are a little bit different though.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you explain a little bit more about that? What the difference exactly is? Because I can imagine it a little bit, but maybe you have.
So what the difference exactly is, right? So, so ecology, it's different to talk about the exact difference, right? So some of the things are obvious. I mean, if you look at the climatic conditions, the Amazon or any tropical rainforest for that matter, is much more warm. It's a higher temperature. It's more moist. At some point, none of your towels really dry anymore if you're on field work. None of your socks either. So, for that matter, the light conditions are different. I mean, in the Netherlands, sometimes you have forests that we call like the beech forests. You have this cathedral forests, as we call them, right? So they really make these big canopies. And even there, you see a lot less light coming in. But in the Amazon, that's even well, worse may not be the right word for it, the appropriate word for it. But you have less light coming to the forest floor. And it has mainly to do with a very strict, what we call vertical zonation of the forest. So you get a very strong vertical layering of the forest. And that's something that we don't usually see in Europe or in temperate forests in general. If you look at a beech tree, for instance, in the Netherlands, it's a very nice tree, but it's just a beech tree. You have a very strong, sturdy stem. It goes up quite high and has a nice canopy. That's fine. But if you look at a forest in the Amazon and you look at one of these trees, it can go up to like 50 or 60 meters, even higher in some cases. All along the tree, all along the trunk, in the branches, even in the very top of it, you have all different kinds of organisms. So the tree itself actually is host to a range of different taxonomic entities, from epiphytes, from vascular epiphytes, non-vascular epiphytes like mosses. You have insects. I mean, you have like bromeliads, and the bromeliad, actually, some of these species, they house ants. So within the bromeliad that's on the tree, you have ants. And then the ants might have fungi, that they care for, whatever. So you get this whole inclusive kind of biodiversity for something that's happening within the forest. So if you look at a forest, usually like from Google Earth or whatever, or like the pictures that you see behind me, you just see the trees. But the tropical forest is so much more than just the trees. They maybe have the largest thing that you see in that sense. But it's not where the most diversity actually is.
No. That's nice. And you you research those trees also. You look at the diversity on the tree, like for instance.
And so I used to do that. So and in particular now I'm really looking into the diversity, the patterns in diversity that we see from the trees itself. So how many species of trees are there? How are they different from area to area? Where is the difference coming from? But I did do projects where we studied the differences in what we call the vascular epiphytes. So those are the plants that grow on trees. They're not parasitic, but they grow on trees. And we try to identify the differences in species diversity from one area to the next, but then also try to see whether they have very strict vertical zonation. And it turns out that some of these species, they really do only occur on a particular part of the trunk, or only occur in a particular part of the canopy, for instance. But they can travel quite long distances because they usually have seeds that can be carried by the wind, for instance. Not all of them, but many of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Before I go to the next question, because my introduction was a little bit messy because I was hearing myself twice and everything was going wrong, I do want to say that the audience can already ask their questions in the chat. We will go to them at 8:30. So if you already have questions for Edwin, you can put them in the chat in YouTube or Facebook. So don't hesitate to ask anything, I guess. So the current state of the Amazon, I don't know when was your last trip to the Amazon, but
it was last year. No. Last year
right? Nice.
December. Yeah.
Okay. And what is the state now? Do we have to worry about the diversity in the Amazon at this moment?
Yeah. So my answer would be yeah, because but not only for the Amazon. To be fair, I mean, I think we have to worry about the diversity of the whole planet in that sense. But of course, we see that in the Amazon, because it has so much diversity, it harvests so much diversity that cutting down trees in the Amazon has a huge impact on all of those other species that I was just talking about. So if you cut down one tree, you're not just cutting down a tree, you're cutting down a tree that houses all of these epiphytes, that houses all of these insects, that houses all of the other animals and organisms that are, within the tree, on the tree, dependent on the tree, etc. So of course that with every tree that we lose diversity. And because there's so much more diversity within the forest, then of course we also lose a lot of it. So I think we should be worried about that.
Yes. And what are the main causes? Because we know people cut trees for what I said, agricultural.
Yeah.
Exactly. But are there also other causes for this?
I think there are many different causes, but I think that the main driver is for agriculture. Yeah. You see slash and burn practices, so it differs a little bit of what the causes are in the sense that why there is actual deforestation. To a minimal amount, there's also deforestation for very practical uses, like for paddles or canoes or whatever. But this, it doesn't scale up to the things that you see for agriculture, for pastures or cattle drives. Yeah.
Is there also? I was wondering, is there also already higher temperature there in the Amazon? Because we're all experiencing higher temperatures. Is there also there?
Yeah, well, of course, globally you have different temperatures, but you have to consider that the Amazon has been warm for a long time, and it's actually been warmer in the past. If you look at the geological history, actually many of the taxonomic groups that we see, but now we're really delving into the details. But some of these taxonomic groups have actually already experienced an even warmer climate. So the warming in itself is not the thing that I'm most worried about for the Amazon, right? So in general, I think climate change and global warming is a really big issue.
Yes.
But I think that the actual deforestation by human intervention is a much bigger problem for the diversity.
Yes. And can you tell us a little bit about the history of the deforestation by humans?
Sure. So I think it's important to realize that for as long as there have been humans, there's always been a little bit of deforestation. I mean, we cut down these trees for really very direct uses like canoes or paddles or whatever. But as I just said, it doesn't really compare with what we see now, right? So nowadays, there are much more pronounced influences of this deforestation. And if you look back into the previous century, then you see that it actually started with governmental stimuli in the last century, around 1960 about. Of course, before that also the deforestation was already increasing, but then you see that they're really providing like subsidies to start with agricultural activities, et cetera, and then you see that there is an increase in the number of deforestation events. And then from the 1970s on, you see that they've constructed what we call the Trans-Amazonian Highway. And that really took a big dent, because what you see then is because they can reach it, they can transport it. And then whenever there's a road in the Amazon or in any tropical forest, basically, you see that you get this like fish grade structure, what we call it. So one road leads to another road, leads to another road. And then you really get this structure of forestry, which you actually can see from Google Earth, right? You can see this from a satellite image, that you see the fish grade structure. And then you see the deforestation along that. And then from the 70s on, it actually, it increases. And then you have, because when there are roads, then the deforestation increases. And then you have mining activities because they can reach these areas. You get agriculture, you get the export of tropical hardwoods. And then suddenly this economy really starts growing. And then the deforestation just increases. Yeah.
Right. How do you think the future will look like in consideration to the Amazon?
Yeah. So if we look at the amount of diversity that or the percentage actually of forest cover that we've already lost, taking into account what it could have been or what it was in the past, then I think that in 2013 we already concluded that we lost approximately 12% of the forest. So that must have increased already to maybe 15, for instance. And then if you look at what we expect for the future, there are actually a number of different scenarios. So we projected, and with we, I mean the scientific community, not particularly me myself, but if you look at the different scenarios that we have, is that you can have the business as usual scenario, which means nothing is going to change. We're going to do the same kind of deforestation. We're not going to improve anything. We're not going to expand our natural reserves or whatever, right? So we're just going to do what we do. And if we do that, then it was estimated that by 2050, that's about 30 years from now, approximately 40% of the rainforest will have disappeared, which is almost half. And just to put it in perspective, that amounts to an area larger than France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, Austria, and Italy, all put together.
Wow.
In 30 years.
Yeah.
That's not the best scenario, right? So that's the business as usual. That's not even the worst case scenario. It's the business as usual scenario, right? But then what if we do reduce the rate of deforestation, right? So what if legislation changes? What if we increase the natural reserve areas? What if we find different ways of compensating for the loss, et cetera, right? That's what we call the improved governmental scenario. So the improved government model, right? But even within that improved government model, and you have to take into account that these numbers are already a couple of years old, right? So I think that we need to change them actually, because we've seen now what is happening in the forest the last couple of years. So keep that in the back of your mind. But if you look at the improved government model, then still we estimate that we've lost approximately 21%. So let's say roughly 20 to 21% by 2050. So that's still quite a lot. That's 1/5 of the Amazon, right? So yeah, we're going to lose a lot of the forest. That's basically the conclusion. But the amount that we're going to lose really depends on what we can achieve in terms of trying to save these forests.
Yeah. There are some scientists who say that there will be a turning point in which when the number of trees in the Amazon is cut, that will be over 20%, then it will become too dry. What do you think of this turning point?
Yeah. So what we just said is that in the improved government model, we predicted that, so the scientific community predicted that we would lose 21% of the forest, right? So that would be that magic number. You maybe reach a tipping point. And what they mean by that is actually that, although we're losing rainforest, right? By definition, if you cut down the rainforest, you're losing directly rainforest, yeah? But even for the trees that remain, this deforestation might become problematic in the future. And the point is that maybe it's something you didn't know, but the Amazon produces almost half of its own rainfall, right? So it's a very moist area, it's a very wet area, but that's also due to certain internal climatic recycling of this water, the evaporation, the evapotranspiration. It flows down the Amazon, not the river, but I mean the atmosphere, and then it rains down again. So the amount of rainfall is, the Amazon produces about half of its own rainfall, and it delivers this rainfall as well as far as like Argentina, right? Because it's a very important hydrological and meteorological system that this whole forested area is a part of. So what could happen is that if you cut down a certain amount of forest, then it might not be able to sustain itself in terms of this hydrological recycling. And then it might become too dry. And then if it becomes too dry, you can reach what we call a tipping point in which the forest cannot sustain itself anymore. So you have this downward going spiral, so to say, that you cut down the forest, it cannot provide enough rain anymore, then it becomes too dry, then the amount of rain becomes even less, and then down and down and down and go, and then at some point you might reach a tipping point where the forest can't sustain itself anymore and it collapses.
Right. So do you find this a realistic point of view that this will happen?
I think it might happen because we already know that the tipping point, the field of biology that concerns itself with these tipping points, it's not something that we haven't heard about. I mean, we've seen that this happens. If you look at forest to savanna transformations, for instance, these are also these kind of tipping points. So you got to compare it a little bit. If you have let's say you have a pasture and you put sheep on it, yeah, and you put 10 sheep on it, that's okay. And you put 20 sheep on it, that's okay. And you say, well, this is going nice. So I put even more sheep on it. There is a point where they graze away so much of the grass that they cannot sustain their own population anymore, right?
Right.
But not only for the sheep, but actually also for the rain, for instance, because you get more barren soil, which does not retain the water as good. So it runs off, right? And then you think, I put on too many sheep. So what do? You take away 10 sheep because you thought, well, with 20 sheep, it was okay. But it doesn't work like that. Because it doesn't restore itself immediately. If you just go back a little bit at where the tipping point started, you have to go way back and let the system restore itself. And I think that that's a major issue, that if we do reach such a tipping point, But the whole point is that we don't know exactly when the tipping point is. That's what we call it, a tipping point, right? Or it's not exactly what we call it, a tipping point, but we don't know exactly where it is. So once you go over that, then you will have a hard time restoring actually the system to such an extent you can get back what you lost, if that will be even possible.
Right. So it's important that we, like the United Nations already has said, that we use the Amazon, that we need to have sustainable management of the Amazon.
Right.
Right. So we don't go there to that tipping point. I don't know if that's even still possible, but how does this look like, sustainable management of the Amazon? Because it's enormously big. How does it work?
So if you hear about sustainable management, it actually is a little bit more abstract than many people, I think, will think when they hear the word management. Because you might think that we're very big horticultural activities going on, like managing the actual forest, stuff like that. But what you have to think about when we're talking about sustainable forest management is actually that in a broad sense, it means that you're trying to achieve a balance between the different needs but also of the forest. So ecological, economic, social, cultural. And what you will try to do with forest management is actually provide an integration of these benefits across all of these aspects. So ranging from protecting the biodiversity and the ecosystem, but also safeguarding the local livelihoods, or reducing rural poverty, or having the benefits of ecosystem services. So you're trying to mitigate all of these needs for the forest. So actually it becomes its own party, so to say, within its system. But we also have to realize that there are many people dependent on these forests, because it's not really realistic for us to go into the forest and say, oh, well, you cannot cut down the forest anymore, because there are people who are reliant on these forests. They have families, they have the whole parts of the economy are based on that. We have to provide them with alternatives. If we want to have a sustainable way of living on this planet and a sustainable way of trying to preserve these forests, we need to do more than just say, don't do it. We need to provide them with the means to actually have a different kind of balance, a sustainable balance within the needs that we have and the needs that the forest has.
Right.
And I think that will be a very important aspect, because that's the only way that we will ever achieve a realistic way of trying to preserve these forests for the long-term future.
Yeah, so poverty is also an important aspect of this.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, the people, you have people living there who are dependent on these, not only on these forests, but for instance, dependent on the agricultural activities that they do. And if you go into those areas and you tell the farmer you can't do it anymore, so what else is he supposed to do?
Yeah, so you have to give him an alternative, really.
Yeah, provide an alternative. Or provide a balance. Say, well, okay, when you do this, but then you have to compensate in another area, for instance. And there are activities that are doing this. I mean, there are whole fields of studies are trying to find these balances and trying to identify what are the ecosystem services that we have, and can we try to build an economy around that. So economical system of providing these services and then rewarding these services as well. Trying to find alternatives to actually create that sustainable future, I think. Not only for the Amazon, right? I mean, of course, we're now focusing on the Amazon, but this goes for pretty much all the diversity everywhere. We have to find a sustainable way of coexisting in these forests, with the nature, with all of nature, actually.
Right. Yes. A great challenge for all of us then.
It's a very big challenge, yeah.
Yeah. So my time of asking questions is up. We're going to go to the chat, the questions that the audience has. And I already see one here. Joanna asks, how long would it take to recover the Amazon forest if humans would stop cutting down trees tomorrow?
Or today, maybe even better. So how long will it take? That's actually a very good question. So what you see is actually that if you stop the deforestation, you will have areas that have been deforested, right? But you don't get back the pristine forest right away. What you see is that there is a difference in the way that these species are actually propagating themselves. You have species that have very tiny seeds, for instance, that can travel quite a long way. And then you have trees, for instance, that have seeds like the size of like almost bowling balls, right? They don't get that far, at least not by themselves. And what you see usually, and that's actually the same what you see here in the Netherlands. If a beech tree goes down, what kind of trees come in first? No, those are what we call the pioneering species, right? So those are the fast-growing species that come in first. And that's what you see within this forest succession, as we call it. So you have a clearing, and then first the pioneering species come in, they grow up, they create shade. So then the climatic species, the climax species can actually grow up, and then they can take over again when the pioneering species go down. And then you get this, what we call succession of the forest, right? But especially for the Amazon, this takes decades. Because these species, they get very old, they grow very slowly. So it depends a little bit on where you are, because if you're in the western part of the Amazon, they're richer in nutrients, for instance. So you get a higher productivity, you get a higher turnover, so you have more pioneering species to begin with, actually. So then the dynamics are a little bit faster. But if you look at Guyana, for instance, where this picture is from, the nutrients are much, much lower. So the dynamics and the productivity of the forest is also slower. So this answer will also depend on where you are in the Amazon.
Right. Okay. The next question is from Anouk. She says, you talked about governmental subsidies in the 60s going towards agriculture in the Amazon. Is it up to the governments to now put, for example, high taxes in place there in order to save the forests?
Well, is it their place? Well, that's a good question. But this also reverts back to what we're doing as human beings on this planet in general. We have to find ways of sustainably living together with these forests. And I think that as a society, we have to do that, because you have to think about trying to put yourself in the place of a farmer that's alongside of these forests. It's a long way from the government. So I think we have to do all kinds of different things. I wouldn't have the answer of we have to do it like this or we have to do it like that, because I think that we have to do something. So we have to try to convince these people, and that's actually what people are also doing. And I'm not talking about like environmental activists or whatever that are chaining themselves to these trees, but these are people going into the areas, talking with farmers, trying to convince them that it's also in their own benefit that we should try to find a sustainable way. So not telling them don't do it anymore, but trying to convince them from an informational standpoint, saying, look, these are the consequences if we don't stop doing this. And I think that the primary thing is we don't stop doing this, because we are also reaping the benefits of their activities. The pieces of meat that are in our supermarket, right? They come, for instance, from Argentina, right? So from the Western society that's not directly cutting down these forests, we might be a big driver of them. So it's not only that we have to make changes there, we have to make changes everywhere. And I think that one of the primary things that we should do as scientists as well is trying to convince by argumentation, by providing solid argumentation of what the consequences are, how long it's going to take, and what the solutions might be, because you have to provide a solution as well. It's like what I just said, like you cannot just put higher taxes on them, because that's not a sustainable way of doing things, because then you put a penalty on doing this and it might work, at least for the start, but at some point this farmer he's got to live, right? So you kind of try to find a sustainable way of doing this by trying to change as a society as a whole, and not pointing the finger and then not saying you have to change, but I don't want it, right? So I think that we have to do that as a whole.
Right. So it's also all about communication.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And also within science, right? So it's not only from science as society, but also from within science. I mean, nowadays you see that luckily it's happening more and more that these different fields of scientists are working together. But, if I have a theoretical paper, which posits some kind of theory about the dynamics of an ecosystem, I need other ecologists to put it to the test to see if that's actually correct or not, or trying to find ways of, proving or validating or disproving actually this theory, because we learn a lot from disproving things. And that has to trickle down at some point to society, because science, it always amazes me. Like people come to you and they ask you about questions like, how does it exactly work? So how does the forest work? What are the ecosystem processes? How do we stop doing this? And then I always think like, we have to take a step back. We have to think about also the smaller bits and pieces of the forest. We have to think about, very importantly, how is this intricate, complex system actually working? We cannot answer it like, oh, you should do exactly this. but that's what is expected sometimes of scientists.
Mm-hmm.
We have to convey that message. So yeah, it's very complex, but we have to do something, and we're getting there. I mean, we really are getting a better understanding of how these forests work, but we shouldn't wait until we have all the answers. And I think that kind of communication is very important, from within science to other scientists, but also from science to society, and also to the government, because those are at the end, they are going to change the policies, but they will do so from the support from the people themselves.
Right.
I think that, it also within the political system is a very, complex kind of system. It's actually funny that many of the things that we're doing in ecology also have their, you can also see that within economies and social structures. It's actually quite interesting. But.
Interesting, yes, indeed. There's a question that is a good one for what you just said. How can we help individually? What can we do as an individual?
For the Amazon specifically, or it doesn't say that?
It doesn't say that, but I guess for the Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, one of the things that you can do is you can really try to see where the goods are coming from that you're consuming. And that doesn't necessarily only mean the meat, for instance, but it also means where your clothing is coming from, where the wood is coming from that you're using. Try to emphasize using, the ones that have the branding that is actually sustainable use, because all of these like FSCs things, right, the sustainable forest use, for the fisheries, etc., etc. There are things that we can do as an individual, even when you're far away from the work, from the actual Amazon. And if we all do that, so there is absolutely no need, for instance, to eat meat 7 days a week, right? And if you do eat meat, you can still choose for the ones that are, better for the environment versus not. And those are more expensive, yeah, of course. But if you could make a choice between eating meat 7 times a week, or maybe 3 times a week, but then those 3 times you can buy the better meat, so to say, maybe not good meat, but better meat in terms of sustainable use, then that already goes a long way if enough people do it, right? So it pays off to actually, for the environment, it pays off to really take care of where the stuff is coming from that you're using. And that goes a long way, like for your mobile phone, for instance. Is it really necessary to buy a new mobile phone every 2 years? Because many of these materials come from mining activities. And if you've ever seen mining activities in the Amazon, like in the southern part of the Amazon, that has a huge impact. I mean, you go down a river, and that's what we call a blackwater river, for instance, because it's black sediment, so it's really like a black river. And then maybe there's mining further up, and it's like coffee milk, coming in, because of the erosion of the environment that you see. And it's really something that strikes me, that people don't really realize that it goes further than just a piece of meat that you shouldn't buy. It's also the piece of equipment that you have. I mean, for my work, I have a MacBook, but I've used that. I just have a new MacBook, because the other one was really not functioning anymore. But I had it for 9 years. I took it with me to the jungle, everywhere, and it functioned. So why buy a new one? Right?
Yeah.
So I think that's I think is a very important thing, that we should realize that everything that we do has an impact. Everything, even from an individual up, because all those individuals, they count up.
Yes, we cannot only point to the people who cut trees in the Amazon. We also must look at our own consuming behavior. Really.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's clear. Ilmar asks, how is it going with the certification of rainforest cutting, and how much do you think this helps?
That's a good question. I must be honest here. That's not my expertise. I know that it's been a long time that they've been working on this, but there's also a lot of difficulties in it, because there's a lot of difficulties in checking it, in validating it. So I have colleagues who are actually working on like the ecosystem services, for instance, and they're really trying to quantify the number of the carbon storage, for instance, that they have, or those kind of things. Does it help? I think so, in the sense that at least it generates awareness. Because you've heard of it, that's one thing. But the other thing is it generates awareness, I hope, at some point for the governments to really know that there are other ways of providing an economical stimulus. But that's also in our responsibility, of course, that we should provide them with the means to do so. So that's basically all that I can actually say about that, because I'm not really that familiar with that aspect of sustainable development.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes.
You can't do everything, you know.
Exactly, you can't. Maya thanks you for your interesting talk. She says, I can imagine there's a sense of urgency as the effects on climate change are detrimental and at some point irreversible. Mm-hmm. Is there a point of no return?
Well, the answer to that is yes. Mm-hmm. At least for us, there's a point of no return. I mean, at some point, there will be so much change going on that life as we know it, right, as we know it now, is going to change. We already see it. Does that mean that the whole planet will be a barren planet within the next 100 or 200 or maybe 1,000 years? Probably not. Because the Earth has gone through many of these major events. The main difference is now, that as far as we know, is that there is an organism running around on this planet who actually realizes what is going to happen. Mm-hmm. That's us. You know, we are part of the problem, but we are also realizing what's happening. And I think that for me personally, that also gives us automatically the responsibility of doing something about it, right? Mm-hmm. Even we are part of the problem, but even if we weren't part of the problem, I think that because we are realizing it, we should try to at least mitigate the effects that we are having on the Earth, because it's becoming quite clear that we are the driving force of this change. I mean, in the past we have these major climatic events. We have we have the major extinction events, for instance. We are now the 6th probably extinction event. At least that's what some of the scientists are calling it. So we've had 5 already in the past. And then you have these changes that have occurred. But what we're seeing now is that it's happening much more rapidly, for instance. Mm-hmm. So is there a point of no return? Well, for some of these areas, I think absolutely. And maybe for some of these areas, we might have already crossed it. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything about it. And it doesn't also mean that we cannot do anything about it. I mean, if you look at the different scenarios in climate change, if we really, put our efforts into it, we as society globally, then we can mitigate a lot of these effects. There are going to be effects. There's no doubt about it. We're already seeing it. I mean, if you look at the Siberian winter, this is the first time in recorded history that winter has not already set in some of these areas, that the ice has not regained its surface area in October, right? That is a change. There's no denying it. We see that this change is happening. Even in our own country, you see that you have more extremes, you have more droughts, you have more floods in some areas. So there are already changes happening. The question is, how big will these changes be? And what is the impact going to be in the near future, in the far future? So will there be a point of no return? Well, theoretically, we already know what we talked about, like the tipping points. Mm-hmm. And you might be able to return it to some stage, but it's going to be really difficult. And then the question is, do we get back exactly the same thing that we lost? Right. And then you come into the ethical discussion. Is it a bad thing if we don't get back exactly what we lost? Is the secondary forest really that much worse than a primary one? It's a little bit less. We know that's a little bit less diverse in some aspects, but at least it's forest, right? Mm-hmm. So there are many, many different aspects of this discussion. I think that the primary reason for doing this is that we should realize that we are the problem here, or at least a major part of the problem, mm-hmm. and that we should mitigate the effects that we're having on this planet.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Sander is also thankful that we are having this talk. I have a question for Edwin. Mm-hmm. Are there interesting examples of initiatives that help recovering deforested land in the Amazon?
I don't know any by heart. At least they don't come to mind. I do know of some of these initiatives, and there are local initiatives that really trying to emphasize, trying to really get back parts of the forest. So they're really, buying up pieces of land, trying to really bring back the forest. WWF, for instance, also does this kind of thing, not only in the Amazon, right, but many other tropical areas as well. So there are definitely reforestation effects. I know for one thing that's actually, maybe that's nice to know, it's in French Guiana. It's an association, Trésor it's called, and they've been buying up pieces of land over the last decades, and now they have quite a nice reserve, and they're now trying to really see from a scientific point of view, like, how is this working? How is the forest working? What do we need to do to maintain it? What do we need to do to sustain it for the future? But they also use it as a means to an end to inform the people, like the local people who are living there, to inform them about the importance of the forest. And I think that that's something that's also a very important aspect. And you have this in Suriname, for instance, as well. And I'm sure that you have this all over the Amazon, these kind of initiatives.
Right. Okay, that's great. Augusto asks, have you had the chance to talk to indigenous and hear from them about the ecological disaster we are witnessing in the Amazon?
Yes and no. So it's actually kind of a nice story that the picture behind me was taken in southern Guyana in a small village, Masakanari. And what I find very important is if we go into the field, we need to, but we always want to be in touch with the local people. Why? Well, for one, they can help us with our work that we do, right? They know the forest, they're familiar with the forest, they grew up there, but they also have a wealth of knowledge. And I think it's very important that we don't just go in there and do our thing and then go out again. We need to take them with us, and we need to really learn from them as well, because they know firsthand the changes that are happening. And you see that in some cases that already they are realizing that, for instance, the older generations, they are realizing that the forest is changing in some aspects. That you see less species, for instance, less mammal species in parts where hunting takes place. And then you say, well, of course, because they're being hunted. But I'm also talking about the other species within the forest that are relying on these other species, right? So it changes the forest structure, so to say. So many of these indigenous people, they do realize it, but there is a big difference between the really far away indigenous people that you hear about in the news, that they discovered a new tribe, for instance, versus the indigenous people that are already in contact with the Western civilization. But they, of course, they do realize that things are changing. Yeah.
Wow. Is there a lot of have you had a talk with them about this also, or this is just?
Of course. I mean, you spent, like, this expedition. I was in the forest for about this particular expedition 1 month, and then the expedition right before this another month. So I spent 2 months in the Guianan rainforest. So of course you talk with them.
Yes.
I mean, especially in Guyana, because they speak English. Many of them actually. Unless you go very far into the forest, really indigenous, but then you mostly take a translator with you,
right?
Because they also, like I said, they help us. I mean, we really rely on these people to help us to go into the forest. I mean, if you don't have somebody with you who knows the forest, that's actually a very dangerous thing to do, unless you're familiar with the forest yourself, because everything at some point looks alike. So yeah, I think it's important to take them into account in anything that we do, and also realize their wealth of knowledge that they have.
Yeah, they live with the forest, so it's
absolutely
Okay. Another question from Augusto is he asks, is there any evidence from your current research you would like to share with us?
Yes, there are many different things I'd like to share with you in terms of my research. So I think that so one of the interesting thing is actually that what we've learned over the past years or decade actually is that what we call stochasticity, so the chance events, has actually a much larger impact than we've realized. So of course there's natural selection, right? So if you look at these different types of forests you have in the Amazon, people also think that's actually, I don't know if you realize it, but there is a lot of diversity in, for instance, soils in the Amazon. So the Amazon is not just the Amazon. You have floodplain forests, you have swamp forests, you have blackwater floodplain, whitewater floodplain, you have white sand forests, you have brown sand forests, you have soils that are higher in aluminum content, you have soils, so you can go on and on. You have all of these different types of forests in terms of soil. And then you also have different species that are actually occurring on these different soils. So we know that there is some type of natural selection that has been going on in the past, shaping this diversity. But then what we also realize is that actually, if you really look into genus level taxonomy, so not really species level taxonomy, but genus level taxonomy, then you see that this natural selection, the the importance of the explaining for the variation. So we're now delving a little bit into the mathematical details, but the amount of variation that these functional characteristics explain. Because if there has been natural selection for specific areas, then you would expect that there is also selection for specific characteristics of these species that enable them to survive and propagate within these areas, right? And what we found is that for some of these areas, this signal that explains the composition, the variation in composition, is actually quite low. So, of course, yes, there is natural selection, and where the signal is there, it's quite strong. But if you look at the overall picture, the overall changes in diversity, a lot also has been driven by stochasticity, which is also another important aspect for the size of the area, because what we know mathematically is that the smaller the population becomes, the stronger this effect of stochasticity becomes, and you might lose more species. So that's also an argument for saying we need to have a large body of individuals to mitigate that effect. And the other things that we realize is that there is a lot that we don't know yet, because this was a very extensive study with over 2,000 hectares of information of forest inventory plots across the Amazon. So it was one of the largest studies from information entropy, actually, when we did this. It was highly theoretical. But we showed that there is so much more that we still don't understand of these forests, even though that we do know, specific relationship, that if this happens, then this might happen, or, for herbivory, this is an important aspect, or we know that successional things happen. There is also still a lot that we don't know about the complex, or the nature of nature, actually, that as Richard Feynman once put it.
That's nice. A nice way to say it, exactly. Maya has another question. Maybe she missed it, but what are possible alternatives for illegal clear cutting? How can farmers in the Amazon rainforest be motivated to make their living in a sustainable way?
Well, what you can do is you can try to see from a scientific standpoint what could be a compromise. So you say, okay, we have a particular part of a pasture area. Do you really need to cut down all of the forest, or could you have like corridors? Could you say, well, you cut down in a certain structure that you still use quite a lot of the pasturing area, but then you remain certain patches of forest, for instance. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it would be that you provide an alternative, that you say, well, maybe you can do a little bit of agriculture, a little bit of using cattle, but maybe you can also provide like ecotourism, or have lodges. I mean, there are ranches that don't ranch that much anymore, but they are like eco lodges, right? So there are different ways of trying to make a compromise, and I don't think that there is any one particular solution that will work for every farmer or every particular system, let alone whether they're only farmers. Because, as I said, you have mining activities, you have all kinds of different activities. So it's part of making legislation, controlling on legislation. I think that's also an important aspect, because, well, you can tell people don't go mining, but if they do go mining, then you have to have some kind of law enforcement there. But I think that the primary thing that we should do is provide compromises and provide alternatives. And one thing that we could do is like I just said.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. So if anyone has another question, then this is the time to ask it. I have one question also, maybe a little bit weird, I don't know. But you are also the director of the Botanische Tuinen in Utrecht, I believe.
Yeah, I'm the scientific director of the Botanical Gardens. Yeah.
Gardens. We are dealing with heating up the planet, and I was wondering if we just create a lot of botanic gardens around Europe, for instance, would that help with the climate challenge we're dealing with?
That's actually a good question. So the thing is that what we can do is we can preserve a lot of the diversity, right? But within a botanical garden, you can never preserve the ecosystem dynamics. So then you would make like very large natural reserves, for instance. But that's different from a botanical garden. Botanical garden, especially for the botanical garden, like the academic botanical gardens, like the Utrecht University, we're trying to preserve biodiversity, but also in a scientific way. We're trying to systemically, classify the diversity that we have. We're doing research. We're trying to find out, how does this work? So that's part of the work that we're going to do in the future, like in the Amazon, trying to understand these things. And just putting up botanical gardens, we will never be able to store all of the world's diversity in these botanical gardens unless we cover the whole planet with it. But then it's just becoming a big nature reserve.
Right.
So, and you want to have that natural dynamic if you want to preserve ecosystems. It's not enough to just say, oh, we need to store those species. We need to preserve an ecosystem because it's an intrinsical part. It's not enough to just say, I'm going to put a fence around this particular tree and I'm going to preserve it. And if I do that for every species, I mean, for the Amazon, it might take you a while because we estimated that there are about between 14 and 16,000 different species of trees alone, right? I'm not even talking about the epiphytes or the insects or whatever. So you might be able to preserve the species, but then you wouldn't be able to preserve the ecosystem dynamics. So I think it's the botanical garden is a good way of providing a platform to teach people about this diversity. I mean, in Utrecht, for instance, now it's closed because of the corona thing. The gardens is not closed, but the greenhouses are. So the greenhouses where we have a part of the tropical rainforest, basically in the greenhouse. You're trying to convey the message out to society. Look at this, look at the importance of it, trying to explain the importance of it. It's not enough to just say, this is important. We have to provide argumentation. So we have a platform where we can actually show this to society. And I think that that's one of the things that botanical gardens can actually do, is to provide that message to society saying, look, this is just a small part of the diversity. And you can provide them with information about the decline of diversity, for instance, but also what you can do, what you can do at home, like for the diversity within our own country, that you make instead of putting tiles in your backyard, you put in different species. Instead of having a balcony that's nice and clean, you put in, all kinds of different, these pots that you can hang on the sides. That you can put all kinds of different species in. And I think that is what we can do as a botanical garden is, of course, preserve some of it, show it, having a nice way of showing the diversity, but also as a means to an end to convey that important message that, we are part of nature, basically. We are in it. We are just a small part of it. Of the complex dynamics, even though we exert a big effort, a big effect.
So the botanic gardens are, in that case, important.
Absolutely, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, one last short question. It's also from Sander. What is your favorite species you encountered in your research? Must be a lot.
Yeah. So. If you're talking about trees, then there are a number of trees actually that really spring to mind that are very special. You have these trees that are huge. You have the huge, what we call buttresses, that you can stand next to, and you're just, you can just fall into the shade of these buttresses, like planks that are going up the tree trunk. I would actually have a very difficult time saying this is my all-time favorite species. I just enjoy the diversity that you have, and I think that that's actually the most important thing. Everywhere you look in the Amazon rainforest or any rainforest, you see something. You're lying in your hammock, you're hearing the howler monkeys, they're having a party on the other side of the river. You look to the other side, you see the bats, then you wake up and you see this huge spider, coming up to you. And then I remember climbing the trees, and I was actually belaying because we were the two of us, and I was stuck to the other person, so to say, because I was belaying that person, and this huge spider came crawling, alongside, and it was big, and it turns out it was one of the biggest land spiders that there is, and I think it was just curious, and to me that is actually the beauty of the Amazon rainforest, that everywhere you look, there's something.
Yeah, that's really nice.
It's the inconceivable nature of nature. It's like what Richard Feynman already said, the inconceivable nature of nature.
Wow. Yeah. Great. Well, the time is already up. I want to thank the audience for asking all the questions, and obviously Edwin for answering all our questions and putting all the effort. It was very interesting, I thought. So
good.
Yeah, nice to talk about this. If you like this lecture, SIP Utrecht organizes these kind of lectures every week, and we also organize drinks and parties and other stuff. So if you like this, come join us, SIP Utrecht. Next week we will discuss the American election. It's going to be an interactive night with several speakers, something you don't want to miss. I believe you can vote for this lecture in the link in the description. So yeah, thank you very much, Edwin, for answering our questions. It was very interesting, and Thanks for watching, everyone, and have a nice evening.